Horror story. It started with the knocking. Slow, deliberate, and always in the same rhythm. 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 more. At first, the village folk thought it was nothing more than an echo from the wind slamming shutters, or maybe the old trees surrounding the manor creaking in the breeze. But the knocks came at the same time every night, no matter the weather, no matter the season. The sound was deep and muffled, as if someone was tapping on the bones of the house itself. The manor had stood on the hill for centuries, overlooking the small village below like a silent sentinel. No one remembered a time when it wasn't there, and no one knew who had built it. There were rumors, of course, stories passed down from one generation to the next, like a shared nightmare that everyone silently agreed to ignore. It was easier that way, not thinking about it. If no one spoke of the house, if no one visited the house, then whatever dwelled within its shadow could remain forgotten. But you couldn't ignore the knocking. It started faint, barely audible at first, but as the weeks went by, it grew louder. At times, the entire village could feel the vibrations in the ground beneath their feet as they huddled in their homes, praying it would stop. The old folk said it was a warning, a sign that something was waking up inside the manor, something that should have stayed buried. Then came the lights. Flickering in the uppermost windows, the dim glow of candles or lanterns. But no one ever saw anyone enter or leave the place. The light would blink on and off throughout the night, an erratic, almost frantic pattern that reminded people of Morse code, or some desperate signal no one could understand. The village was filled with whispers. Children swore they could see shadows moving behind the windows, and hunters coming back from the woods at dusk claimed to have heard screams on the wind, carried from the direction of the manor. Still no one dared approach. One night, a group of the bravest men, if you could call them that, gathered at the edge of the village, clutching torches and axes, their faces grim. They muttered to each other about heading up the hill, about finally putting an end to whatever horror was clawing at the walls of that ancient house. But as they stood there, beneath the cold moonlight, they heard it, a single knock, louder than ever, like a door being pounded from within. Then silence. The torches flickered, and something in the air shifted, an invisible presence pressing down on them, making their skin crawl. They stood frozen, unsure whether to run or scream, until one of them pointed up toward the manor. The windows were glowing again. But this time the lights didn't flicker. They just stayed on, steady, watching. The men didn't go up the hill that night, nor did they the next. One by one, the villagers began locking their doors earlier in the day, drawing their curtains tight before dusk, doing anything they could to block out the sight and sound of that accursed place. Yet the knocking never stopped. And then one day someone from the village disappeared. His name was Jacob, a young man of 18, strong and brimming with the kind of stubborn bravery that made the village elders shake their heads in pity. Jacob wasn't afraid of much. He'd grown up alongside his father, a stout and grizzled man who had long since tamed the wild forests that surrounded the village. His father, Klaus, had raised him on stories of hunting bears and felling trees twice the size of any man, and Jacob had learned from him how to track, how to navigate the darkest woods, and how to fight off the wolves that occasionally prowled too close to the village. But even Klaus, for all his strength, refused to set foot near the manor on the hill. Jacob had scoffed at the warnings like most young men. He didn't believe in the superstitions that held the villagers in thrall. He'd grown tired of the whispered stories about the strange lights and the rhythmic knocking that came from the house. To him it was all nonsense, just the ravings of old women and frightened children. And so, one moonless night, he had told his father that he would go up there, that he would put an end to the knocking himself. Klaus had forbidden it, his voice a rare tremor of fear. "There's something in that house, Jacob. It's not for us to mess with. I don't care how strong you think you are, boy. Some things are best left alone." But Jacob didn't listen. He slipped away in the dead of night, leaving only the faintest trace of his footsteps behind him as he made his way up the hill. His father awoke the next morning to find his son's bed cold and empty, the door to their cottage swinging open in the breeze. 2 days passed with no sign of Jacob. Klaus searched the woods, combed every path he had taught his son, but found nothing. No tracks, no broken branches, no footprints. The villagers whispered about the house, about how they had seen a shadow cross its windows that night, but no one offered to help. They feared what Klaus already suspected. Jacob had gone to the manor, and whatever lived inside had taken him. On the 3rd day, Klaus strapped on his old hunting knife, slung an axe over his shoulder, and set out for the hill. The village watched as he marched through the center of town without a word, his face set in grim determination. The usual warmth in his eyes was gone, replaced by a deep, hollow rage. Some called out to him, begging him to reconsider, but Klaus didn't even glance their way. He was a man on a mission, and nothing would stop him from bringing his boy back, or avenging him if it came to that. The climb up the hill was steeper than Klaus had remembered, and as he neared the top, the air seemed to grow thicker, colder. His breath came out in short, ragged gasps, the mist of it swirling unnaturally in the still air. The manor loomed before him, its weathered stone walls blackened by centuries of decay. The windows, dark and lifeless, stared down at him like empty eyes. Klaus hesitated for the first time. The rhythmic knocking was louder here, almost deafening. It seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath his feet, each thud reverberating in his bones. He gripped the handle of his axe tighter, steeling himself as he approached the heavy wooden door. It was slightly ajar, creaking on rusted hinges as if inviting him in. Without thinking, Klaus pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior of the manor was even darker than the village stories had led him to believe. The faint glow of his lantern barely pierced the gloom, casting long, flickering shadows on the cracked walls. The air was stale, thick with the scent of mildew and something else, something rotten, as though the very essence of the house was decaying from within. "Klaus?" A voice whispered, faint but unmistakable. Klaus froze, his heart pounding in his chest. It was Jacob's voice. "Jacob," he called out, spinning around to face the direction of the sound. "Jacob, where are you?" There was no reply, just the soft creaking of the house settling around him and the ever-present rhythmic knocking echoing from somewhere deeper within. Klaus moved forward cautiously, his boots crunching on the layer of dust that coated the floor. His eyes darted to every shadow, every darkened corner, searching for some sign of his son. The voice called again, this time from the floor above. "Father, I'm here." Klaus's heart surged with hope and dread in equal measure. He bolted up the grand, spiraling staircase, its steps groaning beneath his weight. The air grew colder with each step, his breath visible in the gloom. When he reached the top, he found himself in a long hallway lined with doors, each one closed and silent. The knocking was louder here. It reverberated through the walls, coming from the room at the very end of the hall. Klaus approached slowly, gripping his axe so tightly his knuckles whitened. "Jacob?" His voice was hoarse, laced with desperation. From behind the door, the voice answered. "Father, help me, it's so cold." Klaus pushed the door open and stumbled inside. The room was empty, save for a small figure standing in the far corner, shrouded in shadow. The figure turned, and for a brief, terrible moment, Klaus believed it was his son. But as the figure stepped into the dim light of his lantern, his blood turned to ice. It wasn't Jacob. The figure was pale, unnaturally so, its skin translucent like rotting paper. Its eyes were hollow, black pits, and its mouth stretched impossibly wide, frozen in an eerie, silent scream. It moved toward him, not walking but gliding, its feet hovering inches above the floor. Klaus swung his axe wildly, but it passed straight through the figure, striking nothing but the cold, dead air. The thing reached out, its hand brushing his chest, and in that moment Klaus felt every bit of warmth, every ounce of life drained from his body. His limbs grew heavy, his vision darkening at the edges, and he collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath. As he lay there, his body freezing from the inside out, the last thing he saw was the figure's hollow eyes, staring down at him with an expression that might have been pity or hunger. The rhythmic knocking continued, steady and unrelenting. By morning, the villagers found Klaus's body at the foot of the hill, his face twisted in a frozen mask of horror. But there was no sign of Jacob. And the knocking, it was louder than ever.